Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through one of the most fascinating and complex periods in early English history. The remarkable life and reign of Ceawlin the Conqueror, a man whose ambitions and achievements would forever change the landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. This is not just another tale of medieval warfare and political intrigue, though there will be plenty of both. This is the story of how a young Saxon prince rose from relative obscurity to become one of the most powerful rulers in 6th century Britain, earning the prestigious title of Bretwalda, overlord of all southern England, through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and sheer determination that would make him a legend for generations to come. Before we begin this epic journey together, I want to encourage you to share your thoughts with our growing community. Don't be shy about leaving comments below. Tell me which aspects of Ceawlin's story intrigue you most, whether you have questions about Anglo-Saxon life, or simply share what you're hoping to learn from tonight's tale. Your engagement truly means everything to me, and I read every single comment with genuine interest and appreciation. If you find yourself drawn into this world of 6th century kings and conquerors, please remember to give this video a gentle like. It helps more people discover these fascinating historical stories. And if you're new to our channel, I warmly invite you to subscribe and join our community of history lovers who gather here each week to explore the forgotten corners of the past. So settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Anglo-Saxon England carry you peacefully toward restful sleep. Whether you're a long-time member of the Sleepy Crown family or discovering us for the first time tonight, you're very welcome here. To truly understand the extraordinary achievements of Ceawlin the Conqueror, we must first immerse ourselves in the complex and fascinating world of 6th century Britain, a land in transition, where the last echoes of Roman civilization mingled with the vibrant cultures of Germanic settlers, creating a unique historical moment that would ultimately give birth to England itself. The Britain that Ceawlin knew was a far different place from the Roman province that had existed just over a century earlier. When the last Roman legions withdrew around 410 AD, they left behind not a unified nation, but a patchwork of competing kingdoms, tribal territories, and isolated communities, each struggling to maintain their identity and independence in an increasingly chaotic world. Into this power vacuum had come successive waves of Germanic peoples: Angles from the Danish peninsula, Saxons from northwestern Germany, Jutes from Jutland, and Frisians from the Low Countries. These were not the barbarous hordes of popular imagination, but sophisticated societies with their own rich traditions of craftsmanship, poetry, law, and governance. They brought with them advanced military technology, complex social structures, and a warrior culture that would fundamentally reshape British society. Archaeological evidence from across Britain reveals the true complexity of this transformation. Recent excavations at sites like West Heslington in Yorkshire have uncovered entire Anglo-Saxon villages that existed alongside Romano-British settlements, showing not a simple conquest and replacement, but a gradual process of cultural integration and adaptation that took place over many generations. The landscape itself bore witness to these changes. Ancient British hill forts were reoccupied and strengthened, Roman towns were abandoned or transformed, and new settlements sprang up along river valleys and coastal plains, where the Germanic newcomers could practice their traditional ways of life. The very names that dot the English countryside today, from simple village names ending in tun and ham to the great cities that grew from Saxon royal centres, preserve the memory of this remarkable period of settlement and consolidation. The political structure that emerged from this transformation was unlike anything that had existed in Roman Britain. Instead of centralised imperial administration, power was now divided among dozens of small kingdoms, each ruled by a warrior king whose authority depended on his ability to lead his people to victory in battle and provide them with the security and prosperity they needed to survive in a dangerous world. These Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were not primitive organisations, but sophisticated political entities with complex systems of law, taxation, and administration. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive trade networks that connected Britain with Scandinavia, Gaul, and even the Mediterranean, bringing exotic goods like amber, wine, and precious metals into Saxon markets. The discovery of Byzantine coins in Saxon graves demonstrates that these supposedly Dark Age societies were actually well connected to the broader European economy. The social structure of Anglo-Saxon society was rigidly hierarchical, but also remarkably dynamic. At the apex stood the king, surrounded by his warband of professional warriors who served as both bodyguards and the nucleus of his army. Below them were the thegns, landed nobles who held estates in return for military service, followed by free farmers, craftsmen, and traders who formed the backbone of Saxon society. At the bottom were slaves, usually prisoners of war or debtors, though even they possessed certain legal rights and protections. This social pyramid was held together by a complex web of personal relationships, mutual obligations, and shared cultural values that emphasized honour, loyalty, and martial prowess. The great halls where Saxon nobles feasted and planned their campaigns were not just centres of political power, but focal points of cultural identity where the stories, songs, and traditions that defined Saxon civilization were preserved and transmitted to new generations. The religious landscape of 6th century Britain was equally complex, representing a fascinating blend of pagan Germanic traditions, surviving Romano-British Christianity, and Celtic spiritual practices that had deep roots in pre-Roman Britain. The Saxon gods, Woden the All-Father, Thuna the Thunder God, Frigg the Earth Mother, and many others, provided a divine framework for understanding the world and legitimizing royal authority. Archaeological excavations have revealed elaborate pagan burial sites, where Saxon nobles were interred with their weapons, jewellery, and other precious possessions, demonstrating both their belief in an afterlife and their commitment to displaying social status even in death. The famous ship burial at Sutton Hoo, dating to the early 7th century, represents the pinnacle of this tradition, showing a level of artistic sophistication and material wealth that rivals anything produced in contemporary Europe. Yet even as these pagan traditions flourished, Christianity was beginning to make inroads into Saxon society. Irish missionaries had established monasteries in northern Britain, while surviving Romano-British Christian communities maintained their faith in remote areas of Wales and Cornwall. By the time of Ceawlin's birth, Christian influences were beginning to appear even in pagan Saxon kingdoms, creating a religious diversity that would have profound implications for political and cultural development. The military technology and tactics that would make Saxon expansion possible were undergoing rapid development during this period. The traditional Germanic emphasis on individual warrior prowess was being supplemented by more sophisticated approaches to organised warfare, including the use of shield walls, coordinated infantry assaults, and siege warfare techniques adapted from Roman military manuals. Saxon weapons were masterpieces of metallurgical skill that combined functional effectiveness with artistic beauty. The pattern-welded swords carried by Saxon nobles were not merely tools of war, but symbols of status and power that demonstrated their owner's connection to divine authority. Archaeological analysis has revealed the extraordinary complexity of these weapons, which required dozens of hours of skilled labour and incorporated multiple grades of iron and steel to achieve the perfect balance of flexibility and hardness. The defensive technology of the period was equally sophisticated, with Saxon settlements protected by elaborate earthworks, wooden palisades, and strategically positioned fortifications that could withstand extended sieges. The great dykes that still cross the English landscape, Offa's Dyke, Wansdyke, and others, represent massive engineering projects that required the coordination of thousands of workers and demonstrate the organisational capabilities of Saxon kingdoms. Economic life in Anglo-Saxon Britain was far more complex and prosperous than the Dark Ages stereotype suggests. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive agricultural systems that produced substantial surpluses, sophisticated craft industries that created high-quality goods for both local use and export, and commercial networks that connected Saxon kingdoms with trading partners across northern Europe. The development of specialised craft production was particularly impressive, with Saxon artisans achieving remarkable levels of skill in metalworking, pottery, textile production, and other trades. The discovery of workshop sites across Anglo-Saxon England reveals the existence of professional craftsmen who produced goods not just for their immediate communities, but for regional and international markets. Agricultural innovation was equally important to Saxon prosperity, with new farming techniques, crop varieties, and livestock breeds contributing to increased productivity and population growth. The three-field system that would later become standard throughout medieval Europe was already being experimented with in some Saxon territories, demonstrating the innovative approaches that characterized this supposedly primitive period. The legal systems that governed Saxon society were remarkably sophisticated, combining traditional Germanic customs with adaptations to local British conditions and influences from Roman law. The famous law codes promulgated by Saxon kings reveal complex systems of justice that addressed everything from property rights and contract disputes to criminal punishment and family relations. These legal traditions emphasize the importance of compensation rather than retribution, with elaborate systems of vergild, blood money, that allowed disputes to be resolved through payment rather than violence. This approach to justice helped maintain social stability, while providing mechanisms for resolving the conflicts that inevitably arose in a warrior society. The role of women in Anglo-Saxon society was more complex and significant than in many contemporary civilizations. Archaeological evidence reveals that Saxon women could own property, engage in trade, and exercise considerable influence within their families and communities. The presence of wealthy female burials with elaborate grave goods demonstrates that some women achieved high social status and political influence. The cultural achievements of Anglo-Saxon society extended far beyond material production and political organization. This was a civilization that produced sophisticated poetry, complex historical narratives, and artistic masterpieces that rank among the finest achievements of early medieval Europe. The tradition of oral poetry that preserved Saxon history and values would eventually give rise to masterpieces like Beowulf, while Saxon artistic styles would influence European culture for centuries to come. Into this rich and complex world was born Ceawlin, a prince who had spent his life navigating the challenges and opportunities of Saxon society while pursuing dreams of conquest and political dominance that would ultimately reshape the map of early England. His story begins in the Kingdom of Wessex, one of the most dynamic and ambitious of the Saxon realms, where the stage was already set for the remarkable career that would earn him lasting fame as one of history's great conquerors. The Kingdom of Wessex, into which Ceawlin was born around 530 AD, was already well established as one of the most powerful and ambitious of the Anglo-Saxon realms. Founded by the legendary Cerdic in the early 6th century, Wessex had grown from a small settlement on the Hampshire coast into a substantial territorial kingdom that controlled much of southern England through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic alliance, and strategic settlement. The origins of the West Saxon royal house are shrouded in the mists of legend and early history, with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle providing our primary source for these foundational events. According to this invaluable record, Cerdic arrived on the shores of Britain in 495 with 5 ships and a small band of followers, beginning a process of conquest and settlement that would eventually create one of the most powerful kingdoms in early medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence from sites across Hampshire and Wiltshire supports the general outline of this traditional account, while also revealing the complexity of the actual settlement process. Rather than a simple conquest by foreign invaders, the establishment of Wessex appears to have involved a gradual process of integration between Saxon newcomers and existing Romano-British populations, creating a hybrid society that combined elements from both cultures. The name Wessex itself, meaning West Saxons, was not used during Ceawlin's lifetime, but was a later designation that distinguished this kingdom from the East Saxons, Essex, and South Saxons, Sussex. During the 6th century, the realm was known to its inhabitants as the Kingdom of the Gewisser, a name that emphasised their identity as a distinct people united under their royal house. Cerdic's immediate successors had established the foundations of royal power through a series of successful military campaigns against British kingdoms throughout southern England. These early West Saxon kings were not merely raiders seeking plunder, but state builders who understood the importance of territorial consolidation and political legitimacy in creating a lasting realm. The dynasty's claims to legitimacy rested on a complex genealogy that traced their lineage back to both Germanic tribal leaders and legendary figures from Saxon mythology. Like all Anglo-Saxon royal houses, the West Saxon kings claimed descent from Woden, the chief god of the Germanic pantheon, whose divine favour supposedly gave them the right to rule over their people and lead them in war. By the time of Ceawlin's birth, this royal ideology had become deeply embedded in West Saxon political culture, providing both the theoretical justification for royal authority and the practical framework within which political competition took place. Succession to the throne was not automatic, but depended on the ability of potential heirs to demonstrate their worthiness through military success, political skill, and divine favour. Ceawlin's father, Cynric, had come to the throne around 540 after the death of Cerdic, inheriting a kingdom that was already well established but still facing significant challenges from neighbouring powers. The new king proved himself an able military commander and political strategist, expanding West Saxon territory through a series of carefully planned campaigns while strengthening the internal structures that held the kingdom together. Archaeological evidence from Cynric's reign reveals a period of significant economic and cultural development within Wessex. New settlements were established throughout the kingdom's territory, existing towns were expanded and fortified, and extensive trade networks were developed that connected West Saxon markets with partners across northern Europe. The prosperity generated by these activities provided the resources necessary to support an expanding military establishment and increasingly elaborate royal court. The court culture that developed around the West Saxon royal house during this period was a sophisticated blend of Germanic traditions and local innovations that reflected the kingdom's unique position in early medieval Europe. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with West Saxon royal centres have revealed evidence of elaborate feasting halls, sophisticated metalworking and artistic production that rivals anything found in contemporary continental Europe. The Great Hall was the centrepiece of this court culture, serving not only as the king's residence, but as the focal point of political and social life throughout the kingdom. These massive wooden structures, some of which were over 100 feet long, provided space for the elaborate feasts and ceremonies that bound the warrior aristocracy to their royal leader, while displaying the wealth and power of the dynasty to both subjects and foreign visitors. Archaeological reconstruction of these halls reveals their remarkable sophistication, with elaborate decorative schemes, sophisticated heating systems, and carefully planned layouts that reflected the complex social hierarchies of Saxon society. The high table where the king sat with his most honoured companions was positioned to dominate the entire space, while the arrangement of other seating reinforced the status relationships that structured court life. The feasts held in these halls were not merely social gatherings, but crucial political events where the king distributed rewards to his followers, received oaths of loyalty from subordinates, and made the public announcements that shaped kingdom policy. Archaeological evidence reveals the incredible scale of these events, with massive quantities of food and drink consumed during celebrations that could last for days. The material culture of the West Saxon court reflected both the kingdom's growing prosperity and its connections to broader European cultural networks. Excavations have revealed elaborate jewellery, sophisticated weapons, imported luxury goods, and artistic objects that demonstrate both local craftsmanship and international trade relationships. The famous Kingston brooch, discovered in Kent but showing clear West Saxon stylistic influences, exemplifies the high level of artistic achievement that characterised this period. The religious life of the West Saxon court during Ceawlin's youth was dominated by traditional Germanic paganism, with elaborate ceremonies honouring the gods who were believed to grant victory in battle and prosperity in peace. Archaeological evidence from this period includes numerous pagan burial sites, ritual deposits, and religious artifacts that provide insights into the complex spiritual world of pre-Christian Saxon society. The pantheon of Germanic gods worshipped by the West Saxons was headed by Woden, the All-Father who was believed to be the ancestor of all royal houses and the ultimate source of political authority. Thunor, the thunder god, was particularly important to warriors, while Frigg, the earth goddess, was associated with fertility and prosperity. These and other deities were honoured through elaborate rituals that reinforced both religious beliefs and political relationships. The educational system that produced Saxon nobles like Ceawlin was remarkably sophisticated, combining practical training in warfare and governance with instruction in the cultural traditions that defined Saxon identity. Young princes were expected to master not only the arts of combat and military leadership, but also the complex legal traditions, genealogical knowledge, and poetic skills that were essential for effective rule. The warrior training that formed the core of this education began in early childhood, with boys learning to handle weapons, ride horses, and understand military tactics from experienced veterans of their father's warband. This was not merely physical training, but instruction in the code of honour that governed warrior behaviour and the complex relationships between lords and followers that structured Saxon society. Legal education was equally important, as Saxon kings were expected to serve as judges and lawgivers who could resolve disputes and maintain order within their territories. The complex systems of compensation, oath-taking and ritual procedure that characterised Saxon law required extensive memorisation and deep understanding of traditional customs and their proper application. Perhaps most importantly, young Saxon nobles were trained in the oral, traditions that preserved their people's history, values, and cultural identity. The ability to recite genealogies, compose poetry, and tell the traditional stories that explained Saxon origins and justified their political claims was essential for any leader who hoped to maintain legitimacy and inspire loyalty among his followers. The military organisation that supported West Saxon expansion was based on the traditional Germanic institution of the comitatus or warband, but had been adapted and expanded to meet the challenges of governing a substantial territorial kingdom. At its core was the king's personal following of professional warriors who served as both bodyguards and the nucleus of larger armies assembled for major campaigns. These hearth companions, as they were known, were bound to their lord by personal oaths of loyalty and sustained by his generosity in distributing the rewards of successful warfare. Archaeological evidence reveals that they were equipped with the finest weapons and armour available, while their burial sites demonstrate the high social status they achieved through their military service. Beyond this core of professional warriors, the West Saxon military system incorporated territorial militias recruited from the free farmers and craftsmen who made up the majority of the kingdom's population. These part-time soldiers provided the manpower necessary for large-scale military operations while maintaining the agricultural and craft production that sustained the kingdom's economy. The logistics of supporting these military forces required sophisticated organisational capabilities that went far beyond simple raid and plunder tactics. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive networks of supply bases, weapons production centres, and fortified positions that enabled West Saxon armies to conduct extended campaigns far from their home territories. The economic foundation that supported this military establishment rested on a combination of agricultural production, craft specialisation, and commercial activity that generated substantial surpluses for royal use. The three-field agricultural system was already being implemented in some areas, while specialised craft production centres manufactured weapons, tools, jewellery, and other goods for both domestic use and export. Archaeological excavations throughout Wessex have revealed the remarkable prosperity of this period, with evidence of substantial settlements, sophisticated material culture, and extensive trade networks that connected the kingdom with partners throughout northern Europe. The discovery of Byzantine coins in Saxon graves demonstrates that these trading relationships extended far beyond the immediate region. The administrative systems that governed this expanding kingdom were based on traditional Germanic institutions, adapted to meet the challenges of ruling sedentary populations over extensive territories. The king's authority was exercised through a hierarchy of appointed officials, ealdormen who governed major territorial divisions, reeves who administered local districts, and other subordinates who handled specific aspects of royal business. This delegation of authority was essential for governing a kingdom that was becoming too large and complex for direct personal rule, but it also created potential challenges to royal power from ambitious subordinates. The key to successful kingship lay in maintaining the delicate balance between central control and local autonomy that allowed for effective administration while preventing the emergence of rival power centres. The legal framework that structured relationships within West Saxon society was based on traditional Germanic law codes that had been adapted to local conditions and modified through royal legislation. These laws addressed everything from property rights and commercial transactions to criminal punishment and family relations, providing a comprehensive system of justice that helped maintain social order. The emphasis on compensation rather than retribution that characterized Saxon law helped prevent the blood feuds that could destabilize society, while the elaborate systems of oath-taking and ritual procedure provided mechanisms for resolving disputes and maintaining social cohesion. Archaeological evidence reveals that these legal systems were actually implemented in practice, with burial sites and settlement patterns reflecting the social relationships defined by legal codes. By the time Ceawlin reached maturity in the 550s, he had inherited not just a throne, but a sophisticated political and military organisation that was already one of the most successful in Anglo-Saxon Britain. The kingdom his father had built provided both the resources and the strategic foundation necessary for the ambitious expansion campaigns that would define his own reign. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable careers in early English history, as a young Saxon prince prepared to translate his inherited advantages into territorial conquests that would establish him as the most powerful ruler of his generation. The royal house of Wessex had provided him with the tools for success. Now he would need to demonstrate the vision, skill, and ruthless determination necessary to forge them into an instrument of conquest that would reshape the political map of Anglo-Saxon England. Ceawlin, later known as King Ceawlin of Wessex and Bretwalda of southern Britain, entered the world around the year 530 AD in what was arguably one of the most dynamic and rapidly changing periods in early English history. Born into the royal house of Wessex during the reign of his father Cynric, the young prince grew up surrounded by the symbols and realities of power that would shape his character and ambitions throughout his remarkable life. The exact circumstances of Ceawlin's birth have been lost to the passage of time, but we can reconstruct the likely environment of his early years from archaeological evidence and contemporary sources that describe the court culture of 6th century Saxon kingdoms. The future conqueror would have been born in one of the great timber halls that served as royal residences, surrounded by the weapons, treasures, and ceremonial objects that proclaimed his family's status and divine favour. The world that welcomed the infant prince was one of constant change and opportunity, where ambitious leaders could rise to extraordinary heights through military skill and political cunning. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were still relatively young institutions, having emerged from the chaos that followed Rome's withdrawal just over a century earlier. This political fluidity created both dangers and possibilities that would profoundly influence Ceawlin's development as a future king. Archaeological evidence from royal sites throughout Wessex reveals the sophisticated material culture that surrounded Ceawlin's childhood. Recent excavations have uncovered elaborate jewellery, finely crafted weapons, imported luxury goods, and artistic objects that demonstrate both the kingdom's growing prosperity and its connections to broader European cultural networks. The young prince would have grown up handling and admiring these symbols of royal power, absorbing their significance and learning to understand their role in maintaining political authority. The education of a Saxon prince began almost from birth, with careful attention paid to developing the physical, intellectual, and cultural skills necessary for effective leadership in a warrior society. Ceawlin's early training would have emphasized martial prowess above all else, as military success was the primary foundation of political power in Anglo-Saxon England. From his earliest years, he would have been surrounded by weapons and the men who wielded them with deadly expertise. The weapons training that formed the core of Ceawlin's education was far more sophisticated than simple instruction in combat techniques. Saxon warfare was a complex art that required deep understanding of tactics, strategy, logistics, and leadership psychology. The young prince would have learned not just how to wield sword and spear, but how to inspire loyalty in his followers, coordinate large-scale military operations, and adapt traditional tactics to meet new challenges. Archaeological analysis of Saxon weapons reveals the extraordinary sophistication of 6th century military technology. The pattern-welded swords carried by Saxon nobles were masterpieces of metallurgical skill that required dozens of hours of expert craftsmanship to create. These weapons were not merely tools of war, but symbols of status that proclaimed their owner's connection to divine authority and their right to rule over lesser men. The spears that formed the backbone of Saxon military forces were equally sophisticated, with carefully balanced points and shafts designed for both thrusting and throwing. Archaeological experiments have demonstrated that Saxon spearmen could achieve remarkable accuracy and penetrating power, making them formidable opponents in close combat. The young Ceawlin would have spent countless hours practicing with these weapons until their use became second nature. The defensive equipment that protected Saxon warriors was no less impressive, with shields, helmets, and mail shirts that provided excellent protection while allowing for the mobility necessary for effective combat. The famous Sutton Hoo helmet, with its intricate decorative scheme and sophisticated construction, represents the pinnacle of this protective technology. Such equipment was expensive and time-consuming to produce, making it another symbol of elite status. Beyond individual combat skills, Ceawlin's military education would have emphasized the importance of leadership and unit cohesion in determining battlefield success. Saxon warfare was fundamentally based on the institution of the warband, a group of professional warriors bound together by personal loyalty to their leader and mutual dependence for survival. The ability to inspire and maintain this loyalty was perhaps the most crucial skill any Saxon leader could possess. The psychological aspects of leadership were equally important, as Saxon commanders needed to project confidence and competence, even in the most challenging situations. The warrior culture that dominated Saxon society placed enormous emphasis on personal honour and reputation, making it essential for leaders to demonstrate their worthiness through consistent success and generous treatment of their followers. Archaeological evidence reveals that Saxon military training incorporated sophisticated understanding of group psychology and social dynamics. The seating arrangements in great halls, the distribution of weapons and armour, and the allocation of rewards all reflected complex calculations designed to maintain motivation and prevent the conflicts that could destroy unit effectiveness. The educational curriculum that supplemented Ceawlin's military training was remarkably broad and sophisticated, reflecting the complex demands of Saxon kingship. A successful ruler needed to master not only the arts of war, but also the intricacies of law, diplomacy, administration, and cultural leadership that were essential for governing a diverse and increasingly complex society. Legal education was particularly important, as Saxon kings served as the ultimate arbiters of justice within their territories. The complex systems of compensation, oath-taking, and ritual procedure that characterized Saxon law required extensive memorization and deep understanding of traditional customs. Archaeological evidence reveals that these legal systems were actually implemented in practice, with settlement patterns and social relationships reflecting the principles defined in law codes. The diplomatic skills necessary for managing relationships with neighbouring kingdoms required deep understanding of the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and mutual obligations that characterized inter-kingdom politics. Saxon diplomacy was a subtle art that combined elements of negotiation, intimidation, and cultural exchange in pursuit of political advantage. Perhaps most importantly, Ceawlin's education would have emphasized the cultural traditions that defined Saxon identity and legitimized royal authority. The ability to recite genealogies tracing royal lineage back to the gods, to compose and appreciate poetry celebrating heroic deeds, and to understand the mythological and historical narratives that explained Saxon origins was essential for any leader who hoped to maintain legitimacy and inspire loyalty. The oral traditions that preserved Saxon culture were remarkably sophisticated, incorporating complex narrative structures, sophisticated poetic techniques, and deep philosophical insights into the nature of leadership, loyalty, and mortality. Archaeological evidence suggests that Saxon courts maintained professional poets and storytellers who were responsible for preserving and transmitting these cultural treasures. The religious dimension of Ceawlin's education was equally complex, involving deep instruction in the mythology, ritual practices, and theological concepts that structured Germanic paganism. The Saxon pantheon was headed by Woden, the All-Father who was believed to be the ancestor of all royal houses and the source of victory in battle. Understanding the proper ways to honour the gods and interpret their will was essential for any ruler who hoped to maintain divine favour. Archaeological evidence from pagan Saxon sites reveals the sophistication of religious practices during this period. Elaborate burial rituals, ritual deposits, and ceremonial objects demonstrate a complex spiritual worldview that integrated beliefs about divine favour, ancestral protection, and cosmic order. The young Ceawlin would have been initiated into these mysteries from an early age, learning to understand and manipulate the spiritual forces that were believed to determine political success. The social education that prepared Ceawlin for leadership emphasized the complex web of relationships that held Saxon society together. The institution of lordship was based on mutual obligations between superiors and subordinates that created networks of loyalty and dependence extending throughout the social hierarchy. Understanding how to build and maintain these relationships was crucial for political success. The economic dimensions of leadership were equally important, as successful kings needed to generate the wealth necessary to reward their followers and support their military establishments. Archaeological evidence reveals that Saxon economies were far more sophisticated than traditionally assumed, incorporating extensive trade networks, specialized craft production, and advanced agricultural techniques that generated substantial surpluses. The management of these economic resources required understanding of complex systems of taxation, tribute, and redistribution that channeled wealth from producers to the political and military elites who maintained order and provided protection. The archaeological record reveals evidence of royal workshops, administrative centres, and storage facilities that supported these economic functions. The first recorded appearance of Ceawlin in historical sources comes in 556, when he fought alongside his aging father at the Battle of Beran Byrg. This engagement, fought against British forces at what is now Barbary Castle in Wiltshire, represented the young prince's baptism of fire and his first opportunity to demonstrate the military skills that would define his later career. The Battle of Beran Byrg was significant not only as Ceawlin's military debut, but as an example of the systematic expansion that characterised West Saxon policy during this period. Rather than random raiding for plunder, Cynric and his son were pursuing deliberate territorial conquest aimed at establishing permanent Saxon control over strategically important regions. Archaeological excavations at Barbary Castle have revealed evidence of intensive occupation during the 6th century, with defensive modifications and weapon deposits that suggest it was indeed the site of significant military activity. The strategic position of this Iron Age hill fort, commanding extensive views over the surrounding countryside, made it an ideal strongpoint for controlling the approaches to central Wiltshire. The victory at Beran Byrg demonstrated both the effectiveness of Saxon military organisation and the growing sophistication of their siege warfare capabilities. Archaeological evidence suggests that the British defenders had prepared extensively for the assault, constructing additional earthworks and stockpiling weapons and supplies for an extended defence. Their eventual defeat speaks to the superior tactics and equipment of the Saxon forces. For the 26-year-old Ceawlin, this first taste of victory would have been intoxicating, providing both the confidence and the reputation necessary to begin building his own power base within the kingdom. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased activity at royal sites throughout Wessex, suggesting that the success at Beran Byrg had generated resources and momentum for further expansion. The psychological impact of victory in battle cannot be underestimated in understanding Ceawlin's development as a leader. Saxon culture placed enormous emphasis on martial prowess as the primary measure of male worth, while success in combat was seen as evidence of divine favour. The young prince's proven courage and skill would have attracted followers and enhanced his standing within the royal court. The tactical lessons learned during the Beran Byrg campaign would prove invaluable in Ceawlin's later military career. The combination of siege warfare, coordinated infantry assault, and psychological intimidation that characterised Saxon military methodology required careful planning and flawless execution. The experience gained in this engagement provided practical training that no amount of theoretical instruction could replace. The political implications of the victory extended far beyond its immediate military impact. The capture of Barbary Castle established Saxon control over a crucial transportation corridor linking the Thames Valley with the Severn region, while demonstrating West Saxon military capability to both allies and enemies throughout southern Britain. This strategic success would provide the foundation for more ambitious expansion campaigns in the years to come. The years following Beran Byrg saw Ceawlin emerge as an increasingly important figure within the West Saxon political system. Archaeological evidence from royal sites dating to this period reveals signs of increased activity and prosperity that suggest successful military campaigns were generating substantial wealth for redistribution among the royal family and their supporters. The process of building a personal power base that would support Ceawlin's eventual bid for the throne required careful attention to the complex relationships that structured Saxon politics. The young prince needed to cultivate loyal followers among the warrior aristocracy, while maintaining good relations with his father and avoiding the appearance of disloyalty or premature ambition. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ceawlin was remarkably successful in this delicate balancing act, attracting a substantial following of young warriors who were drawn by his military reputation and generous distribution of rewards. The discovery of weapon hoards and treasure deposits from this period indicates that successful campaigning was generating the resources necessary to maintain these crucial relationships. The cultural activities that surrounded the royal court provided another venue for Ceawlin to demonstrate his worthiness for future leadership. Archaeological evidence reveals elaborate feasting activities, ceremonial displays, and artistic production that created opportunities for political networking and alliance building. The young prince's participation in these events would have been closely watched by potential supporters and rivals alike. As the 550s drew to a close, Ceawlin had established himself as the clear heir to his father's throne, while building the military and political foundation necessary to pursue his own ambitious goals. The combination of proven military skill, political acumen, and cultural sophistication that he had demonstrated during his youth would serve him well in the challenging decades ahead. The stage was now set for one of the most remarkable careers in Anglo-Saxon history, as a young prince who had proven himself in battle, prepared to claim his inheritance and begin the campaigns that would earn him lasting fame as one of early England's greatest conquerors. The education and experience he had gained during his formative years would provide the foundation for achievements that would reshape the political map of 6th century Britain. The death of King Cynric in the spring of 560 marked not just the end of an era, but the beginning of what would prove to be one of the most transformative reigns in Anglo-Saxon history. When the news of the old king's passing spread throughout the halls and settlements of Wessex, there was none of the uncertainty or conflict that often accompanied royal successions in this turbulent age. Ceawlin's claim to the throne had been carefully established over the preceding years, and his accession proceeded with the smooth efficiency that characterised all his political calculations. Archaeological evidence from royal sites throughout Wessex reveals the remarkable prosperity that the kingdom had achieved under Cynric's rule, providing Ceawlin with resources and strategic advantages that few Saxon kings could match. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of extensive fortifications, sophisticated craft production, and elaborate ceremonial structures that demonstrate both the kingdom's military strength and its cultural sophistication. The actual ceremony of Ceawlin's coronation, while not recorded in detail by contemporary sources, would have followed traditional Saxon customs that combined Christian and pagan elements in a ritual designed to legitimize the new ruler's authority and invoke divine blessing on his reign. Archaeological evidence from similar ceremonies throughout the Anglo-Saxon world provides insights into the complex symbolism and careful choreography that marked these crucial political events. The centerpiece of any Saxon coronation was the presentation of the royal sword, a ceremony that symbolically transferred both the power and the responsibility of kingship from one generation to the next. The weapon chosen for Ceawlin would have been no ordinary blade, but a masterpiece of Saxon craftsmanship that embodied the very essence of royal authority and divine favour. Archaeological analysis of royal swords from this period reveals the extraordinary skill and artistic vision that went into their creation. These were not merely functional weapons, but sacred objects that represented the divine mandate to rule and the warrior's oath to protect his people. The pattern-welded blade that would have been placed in Ceawlin's hands contained dozens of layers of different grades of steel, folded and refolded hundreds of times to create intricate serpentine patterns that seemed to writhe like living creatures in the firelight. The hilt of such a royal sword would have been decorated with precious metals, carefully cut garnets, and intricate filigree work that proclaimed the owner's exalted status. Runic inscriptions along the blade might have invoked the protection of the gods or proclaimed the sword's own name and power, for these weapons were believed to possess individual personalities and supernatural abilities that could determine the outcome of battles. The presentation of the crown would have followed ancient Germanic traditions that emphasized the divine nature of royal authority. Archaeological evidence suggests that Saxon crowns were not the elaborate golden circlets of later medieval tradition, but more modest bands of precious metal decorated with symbolic designs that connected the king to both his ancestors and the gods who granted victory in battle. The royal scepter, another crucial element of the coronation ceremony, symbolized the king's role as lawgiver and judge, while also serving as a tangible reminder of his obligation to maintain justice and order throughout his realm. Archaeological discoveries have revealed several examples of these ceremonial staffs, crafted from exotic materials and decorated with intricate carvings that told the stories of legendary heroes and divine interventions. The oath-taking that concluded the coronation ceremony bound the new king to his people through sacred promises that carried both practical and spiritual significance. Ceawlin would have sworn to protect his subjects from their enemies, to maintain justice and law throughout his territory, to honour the gods who granted him authority, and to expand the boundaries of his realm through successful warfare. The response of the assembled nobles and warriors to these royal oaths was equally important, as their acceptance of the new king's authority created the political consensus necessary for effective rule. Archaeological evidence from great halls throughout Wessex suggests that these ceremonies could accommodate hundreds of participants, creating spectacular displays of unity and loyalty that reinforced the legitimacy of royal power. The feast that followed Ceawlin's coronation would have been a magnificent affair that demonstrated both the new king's generosity and the kingdom's prosperity. Archaeological excavations have revealed the massive scale of these ceremonial banquets, with evidence of whole herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and countless smaller animals consumed during celebrations that could last for days. The distribution of gifts during these coronation feasts served crucial political functions, allowing the new king to reward his supporters, attract potential allies, and demonstrate his ability to provide the material benefits that sustained loyalty in Saxon society. Archaeological evidence reveals elaborate jewellery, fine weapons, and luxury goods that were presented to favoured recipients during these ceremonies. The symbolic significance of sharing food and drink during these royal feasts cannot be underestimated, as it created bonds of mutual obligation between the king and his followers that were considered sacred and binding. The great drinking horns, elaborate cups, and ceremonial vessels discovered by archaeologists were not merely functional objects, but sacred instruments that sealed political relationships through ritual consumption. With the formalities of succession completed, Ceawlin could now turn his attention to the practical challenges of governing an expanding kingdom while pursuing the ambitious military campaigns that would define his reign. The strategic situation he inherited was both promising and perilous, with opportunities for territorial expansion balanced by threats from increasingly powerful neighbours. The Kingdom of Kent, under its ambitious ruler Æthelberht, had emerged as a major power in southeastern England through its control of lucrative trade routes with continental Europe. Archaeological evidence reveals the extraordinary wealth that this commerce generated, providing Kentish kings with resources that enabled them to challenge their neighbours and pursue territorial expansion. The growing power of Mercia in the central Midlands represented another potential threat to West Saxon interests. Under a series of capable rulers, this originally minor kingdom had expanded its influence through systematic conquest and diplomatic alliance, creating a territorial empire that would eventually rival Wessex itself in size and importance. To the west, the surviving British kingdoms of Wales and Cornwall continued to resist Saxon expansion, maintaining their independence through a combination of defensive geography and fierce military resistance. Archaeological evidence from these regions reveals extensive fortifications and evidence of coordinated military preparation that suggests organised resistance to Saxon encroachment. The strategic advantages that Ceawlin inherited from his father's reign included not only territorial control and military resources, but also the sophisticated administrative systems that made effective governance possible. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive networks of royal estates, administrative centres, and fortified positions that provided the infrastructure necessary for coordinated military campaigns and territorial control. The economic foundation that supported West Saxon military power was remarkably robust, incorporating advanced agricultural techniques, specialised craft production, and extensive trade networks that generated the wealth necessary to maintain professional military forces. Archaeological discoveries have revealed the sophistication of these economic systems, with evidence of planned settlements, organised workshops, and coordinated resource management. The first major test of Ceawlin's leadership as king came in 568, when he found himself confronted by a direct challenge from King Æthelberht of Kent. This confrontation, which would become known as the Battle of Wibbandun, represented far more than a simple border dispute. It was a fundamental clash between two ambitious rulers, each seeking to establish dominance over the emerging Saxon kingdoms of southern England. The origins of this conflict lay in the complex web of territorial claims, trade rivalries, and personal ambitions that drove inter-kingdom politics in 6th century Britain. Æthelberht's growing wealth and military power had emboldened him to challenge what he saw as West Saxon presumptions to overlordship in southern England, while Ceawlin viewed Kentish expansion as a direct threat to his own territorial and commercial interests. Archaeological evidence suggests that the actual location of the Battle of Wibbandun has been misidentified by many modern historians, who have placed it far from the likely theatres of West Saxon Kentish conflict. Recent discoveries of weapon deposits and battlefield archaeology in the Thames Valley region provide compelling evidence that the engagement took place much closer to the traditional boundary between the two kingdoms. The strategic importance of controlling this disputed territory cannot be overstated, as it commanded crucial transportation routes and fertile agricultural lands that could provide substantial resources to whichever kingdom controlled them. Archaeological surveys have revealed extensive Saxon and Kentish settlements in the region, suggesting that both sides had significant interests at stake in the outcome of the conflict. The composition of the forces that met at Wibbandun reflected the sophisticated military organisation that characterised advanced Saxon kingdoms by the mid-6th century. Ceawlin's army would have combined his personal warband of professional warriors with territorial militias recruited from throughout Wessex, creating a force that could number in the thousands while maintaining the tactical flexibility necessary for effective battlefield manoeuvring. The presence of Cutha alongside Ceawlin in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles account of the battle has generated considerable scholarly debate about the nature of West Saxon military command during this period. Archaeological evidence suggests that joint leadership was not uncommon in Saxon warfare, allowing kingdoms to field larger forces while providing backup leadership in case of casualties. The tactical sophistication displayed by Saxon forces during this engagement can be inferred from archaeological analysis of weapons and equipment discovered at battlefield sites throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The coordination required to execute complex battlefield maneuvers with forces numbering in the thousands demonstrates a level of military organisation that rivals anything achieved by their continental contemporaries. The decisive victory achieved by Ceawlin's forces at Wibbandun established his reputation as one of the premier military commanders of his generation, while simultaneously demonstrating the superior quality of West Saxon military organisation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles record that Æthelberht was driven into Kent suggests a comprehensive defeat that forced the Kentish king to abandon his territorial ambitions and retreat to defend his homeland. The execution of the two Kentish ealdormen mentioned in the chronicle, Oslaf and Nebba, served both practical and symbolic functions in the aftermath of Ceawlin's victory. These high-ranking nobles represented not only military threats, but political challenges to West Saxon authority, and their elimination sent a clear message to other potential opponents about the consequences of resistance. Archaeological evidence from the battle's aftermath reveals the systematic way in which Ceawlin consolidated his victory and established permanent Saxon control over the disputed territory. New fortifications were constructed, existing British and Kentish settlements were placed under Saxon administration, and extensive land grants were made to reward the warriors who had secured the victory. The psychological impact of this triumph on Ceawlin's position within Wessex cannot be understated. Success in battle was the primary measure of royal competence in Saxon society, and his decisive defeat of one of the most powerful neighbouring kingdoms established his credentials as a war leader, worthy of his followers' continued loyalty and support. The diplomatic consequences of the Battle of Wibbandun rippled throughout the complex network of alliances and rivalries that characterised inter-kingdom politics in the 6th century Britain. Ceawlin's demonstration of military superiority encouraged some smaller kingdoms to seek his protection, while simultaneously alerting more distant powers to the growing threat posed by West Saxon expansion. The territorial gains achieved through this victory provided Ceawlin with both the resources and the strategic position necessary to contemplate even more ambitious expansion campaigns. Archaeological evidence reveals intensive Saxon settlement in the newly conquered territories, suggesting a deliberate policy of colonisation designed to ensure permanent control over these valuable acquisitions. The administrative challenge of governing these expanded territories required innovations in Saxon governmental practice that would influence English political development for generations to come. Archaeological evidence reveals the establishment of new royal centres, the appointment of trusted subordinates to govern distant provinces, and the development of communication networks that allowed for coordinated administration across extensive territories. The military lessons learned during the Wibbandun campaign proved invaluable in preparing for the even greater challenges that lay ahead. The successful coordination of large forces, the effective use of combined arms tactics, and the importance of maintaining supply lines during extended operations all became part of the military doctrine that would characterise Ceawlin's later campaigns. The economic benefits that flowed from victory in battle provided the resources necessary to maintain and expand the military establishment that made continued success possible. Archaeological discoveries reveal evidence of increased craft production, expanded trade networks, and enhanced agricultural productivity that generated the wealth necessary to support professional military forces. The cultural impact of Ceawlin's early military successes extended far beyond their immediate political and territorial consequences. The stories of his victories became part of the oral tradition that shaped Saxon identity and provided inspiration for future generations of warriors. Archaeological evidence suggests that his achievements were celebrated in poetry, song, and artistic representation that helped establish his legendary status. The religious significance of battlefield success in Saxon culture meant that Ceawlin's victories were seen as evidence of divine favour and supernatural support. The pagan gods, who were believed to determine the outcome of battles, had clearly shown their approval of his leadership, providing additional legitimacy for his rule and encouraging his followers to maintain their loyalty and support. By the end of the 560s, Ceawlin had established himself as one of the most formidable rulers in Anglo-Saxon Britain, with military victories that demonstrated his tactical genius and territorial acquisitions that provided the foundation for even greater achievements. The stage was now set for the great expansion campaigns of the following decades, when he would carry Saxon power far beyond the traditional boundaries of Wessex, and earn recognition as the most powerful overlord in southern England. The transformation of a young Saxon prince into a conquering king had been completed through the crucible of warfare and the exercise of political leadership under the most challenging circumstances. The skills, resources and reputation that Ceawlin had accumulated during his early reign would now be tested on an even grander scale as he prepared to embark on the campaigns that would establish his lasting legacy as one of history's great military leaders. The year 571 marked the beginning of what historians would later recognise as one of the most systematic and strategically brilliant expansion campaigns in Anglo-Saxon history. Ceawlin's decision to launch a major offensive against the British kingdoms controlling the Thames Valley was not a spontaneous act of aggression, but the culmination of careful planning and preparation that had been developing throughout the 560s. This campaign would establish the foundation for West Saxon dominance in central England, while demonstrating the sophisticated military and political capabilities that would earn Ceawlin recognition as one of the premier leaders of his age. The strategic importance of the Thames Valley in 6th century British politics cannot be overstated. This fertile corridor, with its network of rivers, Roman roads and established settlements, represented the economic and political heart of southern England. Control of this region would provide access to lucrative trade, routes connecting Britain with continental Europe, extensive agricultural resources capable of supporting large populations, and strategic positions that could anchor military operations throughout central England. Archaeological evidence from the Thames Valley during this period reveals a complex political landscape where British kingdoms maintained control over key urban centres and fortified positions, while Saxon settlements had gradually established themselves in rural areas and along major transportation routes. This patchwork of competing authorities created both opportunities and challenges for ambitious rulers seeking to establish unified control over the entire region. The British kingdoms that controlled much of the Thames Valley during the mid-6th century were not the primitive tribal organisations sometimes portrayed in popular accounts, but sophisticated political entities with complex administrative systems, professional military forces and extensive cultural achievements. Archaeological excavations at British strongholds throughout the region have revealed evidence of elaborate fortifications, sophisticated metalworking, and artistic production that rivals anything found in contemporary Saxon sites. The leaders of these British kingdoms were accomplished military commanders who had successfully resisted Saxon expansion for decades through a combination of defensive strategy, diplomatic alliance, and tactical innovation. Their forces were equipped with high-quality weapons and armour, trained in coordinated battlefield tactics, and motivated by fierce determination to maintain their independence against foreign conquest. The challenge facing Ceawlin was therefore far more complex than simple military conquest. He needed to overcome sophisticated opposition, while simultaneously establishing the administrative and economic systems necessary to govern newly acquired territories effectively. The success of his Thames Valley campaign would depend not only on tactical brilliance in battle, but on strategic vision in planning and political skill in consolidation. The commander chosen to lead this crucial campaign was Ceawlin, a figure whose identity has puzzled historians for generations, but whose military achievements speak to extraordinary competence and royal trust. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle identifies him simply as the victor of Bedcanford, but the strategic importance of his mission and the scale of his success suggest that he was either a close relative of Ceawlin or a military commander of exceptional ability and proven loyalty. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ceawlin was operating with substantial resources and extensive logistical support, indicating that this was not a simple raid, but a carefully planned campaign of conquest designed to achieve permanent territorial gains. The discovery of Saxon weapon hoards and military equipment throughout the Thames Valley, dating to this period, reveals the scale and sophistication of the military organisation that supported the operation. The Battle of Bedcanford itself, while recorded only briefly in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, appears to have been a decisive engagement that shattered British resistance throughout the central Thames Valley and opened the way for Saxon occupation of strategically crucial territories. Archaeological investigations at potential battle sites have revealed evidence of intensive military activity during the 6th century, with weapon deposits and defensive modifications that suggest large-scale conflict. The 4 settlements captured by Ceawlin, Limbury, Aylesbury, Benson, and Aynsham formed a strategic corridor that extended Saxon control deep into British territory while establishing forward bases for future military operations. archaeological evidence from these sites reveals immediate Saxon occupation following their conquest, with new fortifications, administrative centres, and settlement patterns that demonstrate systematic territorial organisation. The capture of Aylesbury was particularly significant from a strategic perspective, as this hilltop settlement commanded extensive views over the surrounding countryside and provided an excellent base for military operations throughout the region. Recent archaeological investigations have revealed evidence of major Saxon construction projects immediately following the conquest, including defensive fortifications and administrative buildings that suggest Cuthwulf understood the importance of consolidating his territorial gains. Archaeological excavations at Aylesbury have uncovered evidence of both British and Saxon occupation during the transition period, providing valuable insights into the process of cultural and political integration that followed Saxon conquest. Rather than simple displacement of existing populations, the evidence suggests a more complex process of accommodation and assimilation that incorporated useful British skills and knowledge into Saxon administrative systems. The capture of Benson provided Saxon forces with control over a crucial crossing point of the Thames, effectively cutting British communications between territories north and south of the river, while establishing a strategic position that could anchor future military operations in any direction. Archaeological surveys have revealed extensive Saxon fortifications and settlement activity dating to this period, confirming the site's importance as a military and administrative centre. Ancham's strategic value lay in its position along major transportation routes that connected the Thames Valley with territories to the west and north. Saxon control of this settlement effectively severed British communications with allies in Wales and the Midlands, preventing coordinated resistance to further Saxon expansion, while providing a secure base for future campaigns. The conquest of Limbury completed the strategic corridor that gave Saxon forces effective control over the entire central Thames Valley. Archaeological evidence from this site reveals intensive Saxon settlement and fortification activity following its capture, suggesting that Cuthwulf recognised its importance for maintaining communications with Wessex's home territories while projecting power into newly conquered regions. The death of Cuthwulf in the year of his greatest triumph represents one of the tragic ironies of Anglo-Saxon military history. This brilliant commander, who had achieved strategic gains that would influence English political development for centuries, died just as he was positioned to reap the rewards of his military genius. His death may have resulted from wounds sustained in battle, disease contracted during the campaign, or other hazards of military life, but the loss was undoubtedly a severe blow to Ceawlin's expanding organisation. Archaeological evidence from Cuthwulf's probable burial sites reveals the high honours accorded to successful military commanders in Saxon society. The elaborate grave goods, sophisticated weapons, and ceremonial objects discovered in high-status burials from this period demonstrate both the material rewards of military success and the cultural importance placed on martial achievement. The strategic consequences of Cuthwulf's victories extended far beyond their immediate territorial gains. By establishing Saxon control over the Thames Valley corridor, the campaign had effectively divided British resistance and created the conditions for further expansion in multiple directions. The conquered territories provided both the resources and the strategic positions necessary to support even more ambitious military operations. The administrative challenge of governing the newly conquered territories required innovations in Saxon governmental practice that would influence political development throughout Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeological evidence reveals the rapid establishment of Saxon administrative centres, the appointment of trusted subordinates to govern local districts, and the development of communication networks that allowed for coordinated governance across extensive territories. The integration of British populations into Saxon society following the conquest represents one of the most fascinating aspects of this territorial expansion. Rather than simple displacement or enslavement, archaeological evidence suggests a complex process of cultural adaptation that incorporated British skills, knowledge, and traditions into expanding Saxon society while maintaining Saxon political control. Archaeological excavations throughout the conquered territories have revealed evidence of continued British settlement alongside new Saxon communities, suggesting that the conquest involved accommodation and integration rather than wholesale population replacement. The discovery of mixed burial sites, hybrid cultural artifacts, and evidence of intermarriage indicates that the two populations were gradually merging into a new synthetic society. The economic benefits that flowed from control of the Thames Valley were substantial and immediate. providing Ceawlin with the resources necessary to support larger military forces and more ambitious territorial expansion. Archaeological evidence reveals increased agricultural production, expanded craft specialization, and enhanced trade networks that generated wealth for redistribution among the royal family and their supporters. The religious implications of the conquest were equally significant, as Saxon control brought pagan Germanic traditions into direct contact with surviving British Christianity, in a process that would eventually contribute to the religious transformation of Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeological evidence reveals the construction of pagan Saxon temples alongside the preservation of some British Christian sites, suggesting a period of religious accommodation and gradual transition. The military lessons learned during the Thames Valley campaign proved invaluable for planning future expansion operations. The successful coordination of large forces across extensive territories, the effective use of fortified positions for territorial control, and the importance of maintaining supply lines during extended campaigns all became part of the strategic doctrine that would characterize Ceawlin's later military operations. The cultural impact of Saxon expansion into the Thames Valley extended far beyond immediate political and military consequences. The integration of British and Saxon populations created new forms of artistic expression, architectural styles, and social organisation that would influence English cultural development for generations. Archaeological discoveries reveal hybrid art forms, innovative building techniques, and synthetic cultural practices that emerged from this process of conquest and integration. The success of the Thames Valley campaign established Ceawlin's reputation as one of the most accomplished military strategists of his generation, while demonstrating the sophisticated organisational capabilities of West Saxon society. The territorial gains achieved through Ceawlf's victories provided both the foundation and the inspiration for even more ambitious expansion campaigns that would eventually earn Ceawlin recognition as the most powerful overlord in southern England. Archaeological evidence from the years immediately following the conquest reveals intensive Saxon activity throughout the newly acquired territories, with evidence of fortification construction, settlement establishment, and economic organisation that demonstrates systematic territorial consolidation. The speed and efficiency of this administrative integration speaks to the sophisticated governmental capabilities that Ceawlin had developed during his early reign. The diplomatic consequences of Saxon success in the Thames Valley rippled throughout the complex network of alliances and rivalries that characterised 6th century British politics. Some smaller kingdoms sought Saxon protection in the face of demonstrated military superiority, while others began forming defensive alliances aimed at containing further West Saxon expansion. The strategic position established through the Thames Valley conquests provided the foundation for the even more ambitious campaigns that would characterise the following decades of Ceawlin's reign. With secure communications to his home territories and advanced bases for future operations, the king was now positioned to pursue the territorial expansion that would earn him lasting fame as one of Anglo-Saxon England's greatest conquerors. The transformation of the Thames Valley from a contested frontier region into the secure heartland of an expanding Saxon empire demonstrates both the military capabilities and the administrative sophistication that characterised Ceawlin's approach to territorial expansion. The success of this campaign provided a model for conquest and integration that would influence English political development for centuries to come. As we shall see in the next phase of our story, the foundations laid through the Thames Valley campaign would support even greater achievements as Ceawlin turned his attention westward toward the Severn Valley and the wealthy British kingdoms that controlled the approaches to Wales. The stage was now set for the campaigns that would establish his reputation as the greatest military leader of his generation and earn him recognition as Bretwalda, overlord of all southern England. The year 577 stands as perhaps the most pivotal moment in Ceawlin's remarkable career, marking the culmination of nearly 2 decades of systematic expansion and strategic planning in a single decisive campaign that would forever alter the political geography of southern Britain. The Battle of Dyrham, fought on the rolling hills north of Bath, represents not merely another military victory in the annals of Anglo-Saxon warfare, but a masterpiece of strategic thinking and tactical execution that would establish Ceawlin as the dominant power in southern England, while opening vast new territories for Saxon settlement and exploitation. The strategic context that led to this momentous confrontation had been developing for years as Ceawlin's expanding influence brought West Saxon interests into direct conflict with the remaining British kingdoms that controlled the wealthy territories of the lower Severn Valley. These British realms, centred on the great Roman cities of Bath, Gloucester and Cirencester, represented the last significant obstacle to Saxon domination of southern England, and the final barrier preventing Ceawlin from achieving his ultimate goal of establishing hegemony over all the territories south of the River Humber. Archaeological evidence from the years preceding the battle reveals the sophisticated nature of British resistance to Saxon expansion. Excavations at defensive sites throughout the region have uncovered extensive fortifications, weapon stockpiles, and evidence of coordinated military preparation that suggests the British kingdoms were well aware of the Saxon threat and had made substantial efforts to prepare for the coming assault. The British coalition that gathered to face Ceawlin's forces represented the culmination of decades of diplomatic effort aimed at creating a unified resistance to Saxon expansion. Three powerful kings, Coinmail, Condedun and Farinmail, had managed to overcome the traditional rivalries and territorial disputes that often divided British resistance, creating a formidable alliance that commanded substantial military resources and controlled strategically crucial territory. The names of these British rulers, preserved in their archaic Celtic forms by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, provide valuable evidence for the linguistic and cultural diversity that characterised 6th century Britain. These kings represented ancient royal lines that traced their authority back to the Roman period and beyond, commanding the loyalty of populations that had maintained their Celtic identity despite more than a century of increasing Saxon pressure. Archaeological investigations at sites associated with these British kingdoms reveal the remarkable prosperity and cultural sophistication that characterised their realms. Excavations have uncovered evidence of continued Roman urban life, sophisticated craft production, and extensive trade networks that connected these territories with Wales, Ireland, and continental Europe. The wealth generated by these economic activities provided the resources necessary to maintain professional military forces and construct the elaborate defences that protected their territories. The strategic importance of the territories controlled by this British coalition cannot be overstated. The cities of Bath, Gloucester and Cirencester were not merely administrative centres, but crucial nodes in the economic and transportation networks that connected southern Britain with Wales and the western regions that remained under British control. Loss of these territories would effectively sever communications between the British kingdoms of Wales and their counterparts in Cornwall and Devon, making coordinated resistance to Saxon expansion virtually impossible. The decision to make their stand at Dyrham reveals both the tactical sophistication of the British commanders and their understanding of the strategic implications of the coming battle. This hilltop position, commanding extensive views over the surrounding countryside, provided excellent defensive advantages while controlling the main approaches to the Thames Valley. Archaeological surveys of the site have revealed evidence of extensive defensive preparations, suggesting that the British forces had chosen their position carefully and were prepared for a major engagement. The composition of Ceawlin's army for this crucial campaign reflected the sophisticated military organisation that West Saxon society had developed during his reign. At its core was the king's personal warband of professional warriors, seasoned veterans whose loyalty had been earned through years of successful campaigns and generous distribution of rewards. These elite fighters were equipped with the finest weapons and armour available, trained in coordinated battlefield tactics, and motivated by absolute dedication to their royal leader. Supporting this professional nucleus were territorial militias recruited from throughout Wessex and its recently conquered territories. These part-time soldiers provided the numerical strength necessary for large-scale military operations while maintaining the agricultural and craft production that sustained the kingdom's economy. Archaeological evidence reveals that these militia forces were far better equipped and trained than often assumed, with standardized weapons and equipment that indicate systematic military organisation. The presence of Cuthwine alongside Ceawlin in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's account of the battle adds another dimension to our understanding of West Saxon military leadership during this crucial engagement. The identity of Cuthwine, whether son, brother or trusted subordinate, remains uncertain, but his prominent role in the battle suggests that Ceawlin had learned from the loss of Cuthwolf and was taking steps to ensure adequate leadership backup for crucial operations. Archaeological analysis of weapons and equipment from this period reveals the technological advantages that Saxon forces enjoyed over their British opponents. The pattern-welded swords carried by Saxon nobles were superior to most contemporary weapons in both metallurgical quality and design sophistication, while Saxon spear points and shield construction demonstrated clear advantages in both offensive and defensive capabilities. The tactical approach employed by Ceawlin's forces at Dyrham appears to have combined traditional Saxon infantry tactics with more sophisticated siege warfare techniques adapted from Roman military manuals. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites throughout Anglo-Saxon England suggests that Saxon commanders had developed systematic approaches to assaulting fortified positions that incorporated coordination between different types of forces and careful attention to logistics and supply. The scale of the Battle of Dyrham can be inferred from both the strategic importance of the territories at stake and the number of high-ranking casualties on both sides. The death of 3 British kings in a single engagement suggests that this was not a minor skirmish, but a major battle, where the entire British leadership was committed to preventing Saxon expansion into their territories. The tactical sophistication displayed by both sides during the engagement reflects the advanced state of military development that characterised 6th century British warfare. Archaeological evidence reveals that both Saxon and British forces were using coordinated infantry tactics, sophisticated siege equipment, and complex battlefield manoeuvres that required extensive training and professional military organisation. The decisive nature of Ceawlin's victory at Dyrham speaks to both the superior quality of Saxon military organisation and the tactical brilliance of their battlefield leadership. The complete defeat of the British coalition, including the death of all 3 allied kings, represents a catastrophic collapse of organised resistance that opened the entire Thames Valley to Saxon occupation. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Saxon forces move rapidly to secure the 3 great cities that had been the primary objectives of their campaign. The capture of Bath, Gloucester and Cirencester within days or weeks of the battle demonstrates the thorough planning and logistical preparation that had preceded the engagement, with Saxon commanders clearly prepared to exploit their victory through immediate territorial occupation. Archaeological evidence from these newly conquered cities reveals the remarkable speed and efficiency with which Saxon administration was established following their capture. Rather than simple destruction and abandonment, the evidence suggests a sophisticated approach to urban occupation that preserved much of the existing infrastructure while establishing Saxon political and military control. The city of Bath, with its famous Roman thermal springs and elaborate bathing complexes, must have seemed like a wonder from another world to the victorious Saxon warriors. Archaeological investigations have revealed that the Roman baths were still functioning, at least partially, at the time of the Saxon conquest, presenting the new rulers with sophisticated engineering and architecture that far exceeded anything in their previous experience. The decision to preserve and maintain the bath thermal facilities demonstrates Ceawlin's pragmatic approach to governing his newly conquered territories. Rather than destroying these remarkable installations out of ignorance or hostility, the Saxon administration recognised their value and took steps to ensure their continued operation. This practical attitude toward Roman heritage would become characteristic of Saxon rule throughout the conquered territories. Gloucester's strategic position at a crucial crossing point of the Severn River made it perhaps the most important prize captured during the Dyrham campaign. Control of this site gave Saxon forces the ability to regulate trade and military movement throughout the region, while providing a secure base for future operations in any direction. Archaeological evidence reveals immediate Saxon fortification of the city and establishment of administrative centres that would serve as the foundation for long-term territorial control. The rapid Saxon occupation of Gloucester prevented any possibility of British counterattack, while establishing a permanent Saxon presence in the heart of what had been British territory. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of extensive Saxon construction projects immediately following the conquest, including military installations, administrative buildings, and residential areas that demonstrate systematic planning for long-term occupation. Cirencester, as a major centre of Romano-British administration and culture, represented the sophisticated urban civilization that the Saxons were gradually displacing throughout southern England. The city's capture marked the end of an era, as centuries of Roman and post-Roman political organisation gave way to Saxon royal authority. Archaeological evidence reveals that the transition involved both destruction and preservation, with some Roman facilities abandoned while others were adapted to Saxon needs. The strategic implications of Saxon control over these 3 key cities extended far beyond their immediate military and economic value. By capturing the primary urban centres of the Severn Valley, Ceawlin had effectively severed communications between the British kingdoms of Wales and their allies in Cornwall and Devon, making coordinated resistance to further Saxon expansion virtually impossible. The geographic separation achieved through the Dyrham victory would have lasting consequences for the political development of post-Roman Britain. The British kingdoms that had previously been able to coordinate their resistance through overland communications were now isolated from each other, forced to face Saxon expansion individually rather than as part of a unified coalition. Archaeological evidence from Wales and Cornwall during the period following Dyrham reveals the impact of this isolation on British political development. Cut off from mutual support and facing increased Saxon pressure on multiple fronts, these remaining British kingdoms were forced to adapt their strategies and concentrate their resources on defending their core territories rather than pursuing coordinated offensive operations. The cultural implications of Saxon expansion into the Severn Valley were equally profound, as Germanic traditions and institutions were established in territories that had maintained Romano-British culture for generations. Archaeological evidence reveals a complex process of cultural interaction and adaptation that created hybrid forms of art, architecture, and social organisation throughout the newly conquered territories. The integration of British populations into Saxon society following the Dyrham conquest represents one of the most fascinating aspects of Ceawlin's territorial expansion. Archaeological evidence suggests that rather than wholesale displacement or enslavement, the Saxon administration pursued a policy of selective integration that incorporated useful British skills and knowledge while maintaining Saxon political control. The preservation of Roman infrastructure and urban organisation in the conquered cities demonstrates the pragmatic approach that characterised Saxon rule during this period. Rather than destroying sophisticated facilities that they could not immediately replace, Saxon administrators adapted existing systems to their own needs while gradually introducing Germanic legal and social institutions. The economic benefits that flowed from control of the Severn Valley were immediate and substantial, providing Ceawlin with access to lucrative trade networks, fertile agricultural lands, and established craft production centres that generated significant wealth for redistribution among his followers. Archaeological evidence reveals increased prosperity throughout Saxon territories following the conquest, with enhanced material culture and expanded settlement patterns that demonstrate the success of territorial integration. The religious dimensions of the conquest were equally complex, as Saxon pagan traditions encountered the Christian institutions that had survived in British territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ceawlin generally pursued a tolerant policy toward Christian establishments, neither actively promoting nor systematically suppressing the new faith, while maintaining his own commitment to traditional Germanic religious practices. The military lessons learned during the Dyrham campaign proved invaluable for planning future expansion operations. The successful coordination of large forces across difficult terrain, the effective integration of siege warfare with battlefield tactics, and the importance of rapid follow-up to battlefield victories all became part of the strategic doctrine that would characterise Ceawlin's later military operations. The psychological impact of the Dyrham victory on both Saxon and British populations throughout southern England cannot be underestimated. For the Saxons, the decisive defeat of a major British coalition demonstrated the superiority of their military organisation and provided inspiration for continued expansion. For the British kingdoms, the catastrophic loss represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power that forced reassessment of their resistance strategies. The diplomatic consequences of Ceawlin's triumph at Dyrham rippled throughout the complex network of alliances and rivalries that characterised 6th century British politics. Smaller British kingdoms that had previously resisted Saxon expansion now began seeking accommodation with the victorious West Saxon king, while Saxon kingdoms that had been neutral or hostile began reconsidering their relationships with this newly dominant power. The recognition of Ceawlin as Bretwalda, overlord of southern England, that followed his success at Dyrham represents both the culmination of his territorial expansion and the acknowledgement by his contemporaries that he had achieved a level of power and influence that placed him above all other rulers in the region. This prestigious title, mentioned by Bede in his ecclesiastical history, marked the apex of Ceawlin's political career and established his lasting reputation as one of the greatest rulers of the Anglo-Saxon period. Archaeological evidence from the years immediately following Dyrham reveals the systematic nature of Saxon colonisation in the newly conquered territories. New settlements were established throughout the Severn Valley. Existing communities were expanded and fortified, and extensive infrastructure projects were undertaken that demonstrate both the resources available to Ceawlin's administration and their commitment to permanent territorial control. The success of the Dyrham campaign established a model for conquest and integration that would influence English political development for centuries to come. The combination of decisive military victory, systematic territorial occupation, and pragmatic administrative policies that characterised Ceawlin's approach provided a template that would be adapted and refined by later English rulers pursuing their own territorial ambitions. As we shall see in the next phase of our story, the foundations laid through the great victory at Dyrham would support continued expansion and territorial consolidation that would make Ceawlin the most powerful ruler in 6th century Britain. However, these very successes would also create new challenges and enemies that would ultimately contribute to his downfall, demonstrating both the opportunities and the limitations that characterised Anglo-Saxon kingship during this remarkable period of English history. The years immediately following Ceawlin's triumph at Dyrham marked the absolute zenith of his political career and territorial control, a golden age when the West Saxon king wielded unprecedented power across southern England and commanded the respect and tribute of rulers from the Thames Valley to the Welsh borders. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a kingdom at the height of its prosperity and influence, with elaborate royal centres, extensive trade networks, and sophisticated administrative systems that demonstrated the remarkable transformation of what had begun as a modest Saxon settlement into one of the most powerful realms in early medieval Europe. The recognition of Ceawlin as Bretwalda, Overlord of southern England, represented far more than a ceremonial honour or diplomatic courtesy. This prestigious title, which would later be immortalised in Bede's ecclesiastical history, marked a fundamental shift in the political balance of Anglo-Saxon England, and acknowledged that a single ruler had achieved dominance over the fractured landscape of competing kingdoms that had characterised the post-Roman period. Archaeological investigations at royal sites throughout Ceawlin's expanded territories reveal the material evidence of this unprecedented concentration of power and wealth. Excavations have uncovered elaborate palace complexes, sophisticated defensive installations and luxury goods from across Europe that demonstrate both the scale of royal resources and the extensive diplomatic and commercial networks that sustained Saxon hegemony. The Great Hall at Winchester, which may have served as one of Ceawlin's primary royal residences, exemplifies the architectural grandeur that characterised this period of Saxon achievement. Recent archaeological reconstructions suggest that this massive timber structure, measuring over 100 feet in length, could accommodate hundreds of nobles and warriors during the elaborate feasts and ceremonies that bound the territorial empire together through personal relationships and ritual obligations. The sophisticated heating systems, elaborate decorative schemes, and carefully planned layouts revealed by archaeological investigation of these royal centres demonstrate a level of architectural and engineering sophistication that challenges traditional assumptions about Dark Age capabilities. These were not primitive wooden shelters, but sophisticated buildings that incorporated Roman engineering techniques, Germanic artistic traditions, and innovative solutions to the practical challenges of governing an expanding territorial empire. The feasting culture that characterised Ceawlin's court during this period served crucial political functions that extended far beyond simple entertainment or hospitality. Archaeological evidence reveals the massive scale of these ceremonial banquets, with animal bone deposits indicating the consumption of entire herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and countless smaller animals during celebrations that could last for days and accommodate thousands of participants. The elaborate drinking vessels, ceremonial cups, and ornate serving equipment discovered by archaeologists were not merely functional objects, but sacred instruments that created and reinforced the bonds of loyalty and obligation that held the territorial empire together. The great drinking horns carved from aurochs' skulls, the silver-mounted cups imported from continental workshops, and the intricate glass vessels that graced royal tables all served to demonstrate the king's prosperity, while creating shared experiences that bound participants to the royal cause. The distribution of gifts during these royal feasts represented one of the most important mechanisms through which Ceawlin maintained control over his expanded territories. Archaeological evidence reveals elaborate jewellery, fine weapons, luxury textiles, and exotic imported goods that were presented to favoured recipients as rewards for loyalty and incentives for continued service. The economic value of these gifts was less important than their symbolic significance as tokens of royal favour and marks of elevated social status. The territorial extent of Ceawlin's authority during this period can be reconstructed from both archaeological evidence and the diplomatic relationships recorded in contemporary sources. His direct, Control extended from the traditional West Saxon heartland in Hampshire and Wiltshire eastward to the Thames Valley territories conquered during the 571 campaign, and westward to the 7 valley cities captured at Dyrham in 577. Beyond these directly administered territories, Ceawlin's influence as Bretwalda extended over a network of client kingdoms and tributary relationships that brought much of southern England under his overlordship. Archaeological evidence from these satellite territories reveals clear signs of Saxon cultural influence, with material culture, burial practices, and settlement patterns that reflect accommodation to West Saxon political dominance. The administrative systems that governed this territorial empire represented a remarkable adaptation of traditional Germanic institutions to the challenges of ruling diverse populations across extensive territories. Archaeological evidence reveals a hierarchy of royal officials: ealdormen, who governed major territorial divisions, reeves, who administered local districts, and other subordinates who handled specific aspects of royal business, that provided effective governance while maintaining loyalty to the central crown. The communication networks that connected these administrative centres demonstrate the sophisticated organisational capabilities that Ceawlin's government had developed. Archaeological investigations have revealed evidence of maintained Roman roads, new trackways connecting Saxon settlements, and strategic positioning of administrative centres that facilitated rapid communication across the territorial empire. The economic foundation that supported this unprecedented concentration of power rested on the diverse resources of Ceawlin's expanded territories. The fertile agricultural lands of the Thames and Severn Valleys provided substantial food surpluses, while the strategic position of captured cities gave Saxon merchants access to lucrative trade routes connecting Britain with continental Europe. Archaeological evidence reveals the remarkable prosperity that characterised this period, with extensive craft production, sophisticated material culture, and evidence of long-distance trade relationships that brought exotic goods from across the known world into Saxon markets. The discovery of Byzantine coins, Frankish jewellery, and Scandinavian amber in Saxon archaeological contexts demonstrates the extensive commercial networks that sustained royal wealth and territorial expansion. The military establishment that maintained Ceawlin's dominance during this period represented the culmination of decades of organisational development and tactical innovation. At its core remained the traditional institution of the royal warband, but this had been expanded and systematised to create a professional military force that could project power across extensive territories while maintaining internal security throughout the territorial empire. Archaeological analysis of weapons and equipment from this period reveals both the high quality of Saxon military technology and the standardization that indicates systematic military organization. The pattern-welded swords, sophisticated spear points, and advanced shield construction discovered at sites throughout Ceawlin's territories demonstrate both individual craftsmanship and coordinated production systems that could equip large numbers of warriors with standardized equipment. The fortification systems that protected Ceawlin's territories during this period show clear evidence of strategic planning and coordinated construction that created an integrated defensive network capable of responding to threats from multiple directions. Archaeological investigations have revealed elaborate earthworks, strategic positioning of strongholds, and communication systems that allowed for rapid coordination of defensive responses across extensive frontiers. The cultural achievements of this period reflect both the prosperity generated by territorial expansion and the sophisticated artistic traditions that developed from the interaction between Saxon and British populations. Archaeological discoveries include elaborate metalwork, sophisticated jewellery, advanced textile production, and architectural innovations that represent a flowering of creative achievement supported by royal patronage and commercial prosperity. The religious landscape of Ceawlin's territories during this period remained dominated by traditional Germanic paganism, with elaborate ceremonies honouring the gods who were believed to grant victory in battle and prosperity in peace. Archaeological evidence includes numerous pagan burial sites, ritual deposits, and religious artefacts that provide insights into the complex spiritual world that sustained Saxon political authority and cultural identity. The great pagan temples that may have been constructed during this period would have served not only religious functions, but also political purposes as centres where tribal identity was reinforced and royal authority was legitimised through connection to divine favour. Archaeological investigations at sites that may have served these functions reveal evidence of elaborate ceremonial activities and the deposition of valuable objects as offerings to the gods. The diplomatic relationships that sustained Ceawlin's position as Bretwalda required constant attention and sophisticated political skills that went far beyond simple military dominance. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive networks of gift exchange, intermarriage, and cultural interaction that created and maintained the alliances necessary for effective overlordship over diverse populations. The tributary relationships that bound subordinate kingdoms to Ceawlin's overlordship were formalised through elaborate ceremonies that combined elements of traditional Germanic law with innovations adapted to the specific circumstances of territorial empire. Archaeological evidence suggests that these relationships were maintained through regular payments of tribute, provision of military service during major campaigns, and diplomatic deference in inter-kingdom negotiations. The challenges facing Ceawlin during this period of maximum power were as significant as his achievements, requiring constant vigilance and sophisticated political management to maintain the complex relationships that held his territorial empire together. The success that had elevated him to unprecedented heights also created new enemies and potential rivals who were constantly seeking opportunities to challenge his dominance. The rise of Mercia under increasingly capable rulers represented perhaps the most serious long-term threat to West Saxon hegemony. Archaeological evidence from Mercian territories during this period reveals rapid development of military capabilities, administrative systems, and territorial control that would eventually create a rival capable of challenging Saxon dominance in central England. The survival of independent British kingdoms in Wales and Cornwall provided another potential source of instability, as these territories served as refuges for British populations displaced by Saxon expansion and bases for potential resistance movements. Archaeological evidence reveals continued military preparation and defensive construction in these regions that suggest organised resistance to Saxon overlordship. The internal challenges of governing diverse populations across extensive territories created ongoing pressures that required constant attention and sophisticated political solutions. Archaeological evidence reveals tensions between Saxon settlers and British populations in newly conquered territories, competition between different regions for royal attention and resources, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining loyalty among subordinate officials who administered distant provinces. The economic pressures of maintaining a large military establishment and elaborate royal court placed significant strains on the resources of even the most prosperous territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that the costs of supporting professional warriors, maintaining fortifications, and conducting diplomatic relationships required increasingly sophisticated systems of taxation and resource extraction. The religious transformation that was beginning to affect Anglo-Saxon England during this period created additional complexities for Ceawlin's rule. While he remained committed to traditional pagan practices, Christian missionaries were beginning to make inroads among neighbouring kingdoms, creating potential sources of cultural and political tension that would eventually influence the stability of his territorial empire. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the first signs of Christian influence in some of Ceawlin's territories, with artifact assemblages that include Christian symbols alongside traditional pagan objects. This religious diversity created both opportunities and challenges for royal authority, requiring careful management to avoid alienating important constituencies while maintaining traditional sources of legitimacy. The cultural synthesis that emerged from the interaction between Saxon and British populations during this period created new forms of artistic expression, social organisation, and political identity that would influence English development for centuries to come. Archaeological discoveries reveal hybrid art forms, innovative architectural techniques, and synthetic cultural practices that emerge from this process of conquest and integration. The legal systems that governed relationships within Ceawlin's territorial empire represented a sophisticated adaptation of traditional Germanic law to the challenges of ruling diverse populations with different cultural backgrounds and legal traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that these legal innovations were actually implemented in practice, with settlement patterns and social relationships that reflect the principles defined in royal law codes. The educational and cultural institutions that developed during this period reflected both the sophisticated administrative needs of territorial empire and the cultural ambitions of a royal court that saw itself as the equal of any contemporary power. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized craft production, advanced architectural techniques, and sophisticated material culture that demonstrate both individual achievement and systematic support for cultural development. The international relationships that characterize this period demonstrate the extent to which Ceawlin's achievements had elevated Saxon England to a position of significance in the broader European political system. Archaeological evidence reveals diplomatic contacts with Frankish kingdoms, Scandinavian territories, and other contemporary powers that recognised West Saxon achievements and sought to establish mutually beneficial relationships. The height of Ceawlin's power during the late 570s and early 580s represents one of the remarkable achievement stories in early English history, demonstrating what could be accomplished through military genius, political skill, and administrative innovation during this formative period. The territorial empire he had created provided a model for future English unification efforts, while establishing many of the institutions and relationships that would influence political development for generations to come. However, as we shall see in the next phase of our story, the very success that had elevated Ceawlin to unprecedented heights also created the conditions for his eventual downfall. The enemies he had defeated were not destroyed but merely contained. The rivalries he had overcome continued to simmer beneath the surface, and new challenges were emerging that would test even his remarkable capabilities as a political and military leader. The stage was now set for the final act of Ceawlin's remarkable career, a period of crisis and ultimate defeat that would demonstrate both the achievements and the limitations of personal rule in the turbulent world of 6th century Anglo-Saxon England. The lessons of his rise and fall would influence English political development for centuries to come, providing both inspiration and caution for future rulers who would pursue their own dreams of territorial expansion and national unification. The year 584 marked both the zenith and the beginning of the end of Ceawlin's remarkable career, as the aging king embarked on what would prove to be his final major military campaign, an ambitious expedition that promised to extend Saxon power even further into British territory, but would ultimately exact a devastating personal cost that would undermine the very foundations of his political authority. The Battle of Dyrham, fought somewhere in the rolling hills of what is now Oxfordshire, would demonstrate both Ceawlin's continued military genius and the growing limitations that age, overextension, and accumulated enemies were placing on his once invincible war machine. Archaeological evidence from the years preceding this final campaign reveals a kingdom at the height of its material prosperity, but also showing subtle signs of the strains that would eventually contribute to its political collapse. Excavations at royal sites throughout Wessex have uncovered evidence of massive construction projects, elaborate defensive installations, and luxury goods that demonstrate continued wealth and power, but also suggest increasing concerns about security and the need to project strength in the face of growing challenges. The strategic context that led to the Dyrham campaign had been developing throughout the early 580s as Ceawlin's continued success attracted both imitators and enemies who were determined to challenge his dominance. The rise of Mercia under increasingly capable rulers had created a powerful rival in central England, while the survival of independent British kingdoms in Wales provided ongoing sources of resistance and potential bases for coordinated opposition to Saxon expansion. The decision to launch another major offensive against British territories may have been motivated by several factors that archaeological evidence is only beginning to reveal. Economic pressures resulting from the costs of maintaining an extensive territorial empire may have created the need for new sources of wealth and tribute, while political considerations may have demanded continued military success to maintain the loyalty of an increasingly restive warrior aristocracy. Archaeological investigations at sites throughout the upper Thames Valley and surrounding regions have revealed evidence of increasing military activity during the early 580s, with weapon deposits, fortification construction, and other indicators of preparation for major conflict. This archaeological signature suggests that both Saxon and British forces were anticipating renewed warfare and were making substantial preparations for the coming confrontation. The British kingdoms that faced Ceawlin's final offensive were not the weakened and divided opponents of earlier campaigns, but reorganised and reinvigorated realms that had learned valuable lessons from previous Saxon successes. Archaeological evidence from British sites dating to this period reveals sophisticated defensive preparations, improved military equipment, and evidence of coordinated planning that suggests organised resistance to Saxon expansion. The composition of Ceawlin's army for the Dyrham campaign reflected both the accumulated experience of decades of successful warfare and the growing challenges facing an aging king whose physical capabilities were no longer what they had been in his youth. At 54 years of age, Ceawlin was elderly by the standards of his time, and the physical demands of active military leadership were becoming increasingly difficult for him to meet. The presence of Cuthar alongside Ceawlin in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles account of the battle takes on particular significance in light of these considerations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cuthar may have been the king's son and designated heir, serving not only as a military commander, but as the future leader around whom the kingdom's continued expansion would be organised. The strategic objectives of the Fethon League campaign appear to have been remarkably ambitious, aimed at extending Saxon control even further into British territory and potentially opening new fronts for future expansion toward Wales. Archaeological evidence from the campaign route reveals extensive Saxon military activity, with temporary camps, supply depots, and other logistical installations that demonstrate the scale and sophistication of the operation. The Battle of Fethon League itself, while recorded only briefly in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, appears to have been a complex and hard-fought engagement that initially went in favour of the Saxon forces. The Chronicle records that Ceawlin and Cuthar fought against the Britons at the place which is named Fethon League, and Cuthar was killed, and Ceawlin took many towns and countless war loot, and in anger he turned back to his own territory. Archaeological investigation of potential battle sites in the Oxfordshire region has revealed evidence of intensive 6th century military activity, with weapon deposits, battlefield archaeology, and settlement disturbances that may be connected to this final Saxon offensive. The scale of the archaeological evidence suggests that this was indeed a major engagement involving substantial forces on both sides. The death of Cuthar during the battle represents one of the most tragic and politically significant moments in Ceawlin's entire career. This trusted commander and likely heir had been groomed for years to succeed his father and continue the dynasty's expansion policies, making his loss not merely a personal tragedy, but a political catastrophe that would undermine the entire foundation of royal succession planning. Archaeological evidence from high-status burials of this period reveals the elaborate honours accorded to fallen warriors and the deep cultural significance placed on dying gloriously in battle. However, the political implications of Cuthar's death extended far beyond cultural mourning rituals, creating a succession crisis that would ultimately contribute to Ceawlin's downfall and the fragmentation of his territorial empire. The initial military success of the campaign, with the capture of numerous towns and substantial war loot, demonstrates that Ceawlin's forces retained their tactical superiority and organisational advantages over their British opponents. Archaeological evidence from settlements throughout the campaign region reveals Saxon occupation and the systematic extraction of wealth and resources that characterised successful military operations during this period. However, the Chronicle's cryptic reference to Ceawlin returning in anger to his own territory suggests that something went seriously wrong during or after the battle that transformed apparent victory into strategic defeat. The phrase itself appears to be drawn from saga material and may reflect the dramatic emotional impact of Cuthar's death on the aging king and his remaining forces. The psychological impact of losing his son and designated heir in battle would have been devastating for Ceawlin personally, but the political consequences were even more severe. Without a clear successor who commanded both military respect and dynastic legitimacy, the entire structure of royal authority that had sustained territorial expansion for nearly 3 decades was suddenly thrown into question. Archaeological evidence from the years immediately following Fethon League reveals significant changes in the material culture and settlement patterns of Ceawlin's territories that suggest political instability and economic disruption. The massive construction projects that had characterised the height of his power were abandoned or scaled back, while defensive preparations increased substantially throughout the kingdom. The administrative challenge of governing an extensive territorial empire without adequate leadership succession became increasingly apparent in the aftermath of Cuthar's death. Archaeological evidence reveals the gradual withdrawal of Saxon authority from some of the more remote conquered territories, as limited resources were concentrated on defending core areas against increasingly aggressive enemies. The diplomatic consequences of the Fethon League campaign rippled throughout the complex network of alliances and rivalries that characterised late 6th century British politics. Ceawlin's obvious vulnerability encouraged ambitious rivals to challenge his authority, while the demonstration of Saxon military limitations emboldened British resistance movements throughout his territories. The rise of Ceawlin as a potential challenger to Ceawlin's authority becomes increasingly apparent in the archaeological record from this period. As a member of the royal family with legitimate claims to the throne, Ceawlin had been carefully building his own power base within Wessex, while avoiding direct confrontation with his uncle. The succession crisis created by Cuthar's death provided him with the opportunity he had been waiting for. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Ceawl's faction reveals increasing military activity and resource accumulation that suggests systematic preparation for a challenge to royal authority. The discovery of weapon hoards, fortification construction, and evidence of alliance building indicates that opposition to Ceawlin's continued rule was becoming organised and substantial. The economic pressures facing the kingdom during this period were compounded by the costs of the Fethon League campaign and the ongoing need to maintain defensive preparations against multiple potential enemies. Archaeological evidence reveals declining prosperity in some regions, with reduced trade activity, scaled-back construction projects, and other indicators of economic stress. The religious dimensions of Ceawlin's decline may also have played a role in undermining his political authority. The gradual spread of Christianity among neighbouring Saxon kingdoms created new forms of legitimacy and alliance that excluded the pagan West Saxon king from important diplomatic relationships. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing Christian influence even within Ceawlin's own territories, suggesting that religious change was beginning to affect political loyalties. The military innovations that had given Saxon forces decisive advantages during Ceawlin's earlier campaigns were gradually being adopted by their enemies, levelling the playing field and making future conquests far more difficult to achieve. Archaeological evidence reveals improvements in British military technology, defensive techniques, and organisational capabilities that reduce Saxon advantages in battlefield effectiveness. The logistical challenges of maintaining military operations across increasingly extensive territories were becoming more apparent as Ceawlin's forces were stretched thin across multiple potential theatres of conflict. Archaeological evidence reveals the strain placed on Saxon administrative and supply systems by the need to maintain readiness across numerous potential battlefronts. The cultural synthesis that had emerged from decades of Saxon-British interaction was beginning to create new forms of identity and loyalty that transcended simple ethnic divisions. Archaeological evidence reveals mixed populations, hybrid cultural practices, and complex social relationships that made traditional approaches to territorial control increasingly inadequate. The international relationships that had sustained Ceawlin's position during his period of maximum power were also beginning to shift as continental powers reassessed their connections to British kingdoms. Archaeological evidence reveals changing patterns of trade and diplomatic contact that suggest declining Saxon influence in broader European political systems. The personal toll that decades of constant warfare and political leadership had taken on Ceawlin himself was becoming increasingly apparent to his followers and enemies alike. At an age when most men of his era were already dead, the king was struggling to maintain the physical vigour and mental acuity necessary for effective leadership in a warrior society that valued personal prowess above all other qualities. The succession planning that had been disrupted by Cutha's death created ongoing uncertainty about the kingdom's future direction and leadership. Archaeological evidence suggests that various factions within the royal family and warrior aristocracy were beginning to position themselves for the eventual transition, creating internal tensions that weakened the kingdom's ability to respond to external threats. The territorial overextension that had been manageable during periods of successful expansion became increasingly problematic as military pressures mounted and resources became scarce. Archaeological evidence reveals the gradual abandonment of some outlying positions and the concentration of defensive efforts on protecting core territories and strategic strongpoints. The legacy of Ceawlin's military innovations and territorial achievements remained impressive despite the setbacks of his final campaign. The administrative systems he had developed, the territorial boundaries he had established, and the cultural synthesis he had fostered would all influence English development for generations to come, even as his personal political authority began to crumble. Archaeological evidence from the years following Fethon League reveals both the continued strength of Saxon civilization and the growing vulnerabilities that would ultimately lead to Ceawlin's downfall. The material prosperity and cultural sophistication of his territories remained impressive, but the political cohesion that had sustained territorial expansion was beginning to fragment under the pressures of succession, uncertainty, and external challenge. The stage was now set for the final crisis that would end Ceawlin's remarkable career and demonstrate both the achievements and the limitations of personal rule in the turbulent world of 6th century Anglo-Saxon England. The lessons learned from his rise and fall would influence English political development for centuries to come, providing both inspiration and cautionary guidance for future rulers who would pursue their own dreams of territorial expansion and national unification. As we approach the climactic events of 592, when Ceawlin's long reign would finally come to an end, the archaeological evidence reveals a kingdom still capable of impressive achievements, but increasingly vulnerable to the accumulated pressures and contradictions that had built up during 3 decades of continuous expansion and political centralization. The final act of this remarkable story would demonstrate both the possibilities and the limitations that characterized Anglo-Saxon kingship during this formative period of English history. The year 592 dawned with ominous portents throughout the kingdom of Wessex, as the accumulated pressures and contradictions of Ceawlin's long reign finally converged in a perfect storm of political crisis that would sweep away one of the most successful rulers in Anglo-Saxon history. Archaeological evidence from this crucial year reveals a kingdom still impressive in its material achievements, but increasingly unable to contain the forces of opposition and ambition that had been building beneath the surface of royal authority for nearly a decade. The aging king, now in his early 60s and visibly worn by the physical and emotional toll of constant warfare and political leadership, faced challenges on multiple fronts that would have tested even a ruler in his prime. The succession crisis created by Cutha's death at Fethan League had never been adequately resolved, leaving questions about the kingdom's future leadership that encouraged ambitious rivals while undermining the confidence of supporters who had remained loyal through previous difficulties. Archaeological investigations at royal sites throughout Wessex during this period reveal subtle but significant changes in material culture and settlement patterns that suggest growing political instability. The massive construction projects that had characterized the height of Ceawlin's power were largely abandoned. Defensive preparations were intensified throughout the kingdom, and there are signs of resource hoarding and preparation for conflict that indicate widespread anticipation of major political upheaval. The rise of Ceawlin as the leader of organised opposition to Ceawlin's continued rule represents one of the most fascinating aspects of this final crisis. As a member of the royal family with legitimate claims to the throne, Ceawlin had spent years carefully building his own power base within Wessex, while avoiding direct confrontation with his formidable uncle. Archaeological evidence reveals that his faction had been systematically accumulating weapons, building alliances, and preparing for the moment when they could challenge royal authority with some hope of success. The strategic brilliance of Ceawlin's approach to this dynastic struggle can be seen in his careful cultivation of support among key constituencies throughout the kingdom. Rather than simply relying on his royal bloodline, he had worked to build relationships with the warrior aristocracy, territorial administrators, and regional leaders who controlled the actual levers of power. Within Saxon society, archaeological evidence suggests that this political groundwork had been years in the making and was remarkably comprehensive in its scope. The international dimension of Ceawlin's crisis was equally significant, as neighbouring kingdoms that had long resented West Saxon dominance began to sense opportunity in the aging king's growing vulnerabilities. The rise of Mercia under increasingly capable rulers had created a powerful rival that was eager to challenge Saxon hegemony in central England, while surviving British kingdoms saw potential for recovering territories that had been lost during Ceawlin's earlier campaigns. Archaeological evidence from Mercian sites during this period reveals extensive military preparation and resource accumulation that suggests systematic planning for major territorial expansion at Saxon expense. The discovery of weapon hoards, fortification construction, and evidence of alliance building indicates that Mercian leaders were positioning themselves to exploit any weakness in West Saxon defences. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterised late 6th century British politics created opportunities for coordinated action against Ceawlin's position that had not existed during his period of maximum strength. Archaeological evidence reveals increased diplomatic activity, evidence of gift exchange, and other indicators of political coordination that suggest his enemies were working together in unprecedented ways. The economic pressures facing Wessex during this period were compounded by the costs of maintaining extensive defensive preparations while simultaneously dealing with the disruption of trade networks and resource extraction systems that had sustained royal wealth for decades. Archaeological evidence reveals declining prosperity in some regions, with reduced craft production, scaled-back settlement activities, and other indicators of economic stress. The religious transformation that was beginning to affect Anglo-Saxon England created additional complexities for Ceawlin's political position. As one of the last great pagan kings, he was increasingly isolated from the diplomatic and cultural networks that were developing around Christian rulers throughout the Saxon kingdoms. Archaeological evidence reveals growing Christian influence within his own territories, suggesting that religious change was beginning to affect traditional sources of royal legitimacy. The military advantages that had sustained Saxon expansion during Ceawlin's earlier campaigns were no longer as decisive as they had once been. Archaeological evidence reveals that British and other enemies had adopted Saxon military technologies and tactical innovations, creating a more level playing field that made future conquest far more difficult, while increasing the resources required for defensive operations. The site chosen for the final confrontation, Woden's Barrow, now known as Adam's Grave near Alton Priors in Wiltshire, carried profound symbolic significance that added another dimension to this dynastic struggle. This prehistoric burial mound had acquired sacred importance in Saxon culture due to its association with Woden, the chief god of their pantheon and the mythical ancestor of all royal houses. To fight at such a symbolically charged location added religious and cultural dimensions to what might otherwise have been seen as merely a political conflict. Archaeological investigation of the battle site has revealed evidence of intensive 6th century activity, with weapon deposits, battlefield archaeology, and other indicators that suggest this was indeed the location of a major military engagement. The scale of the archaeological evidence indicates that substantial forces were involved on both sides, making this far more than a simple palace coup or minor succession dispute. The composition of the forces that faced each other at Woden's Barrow reflected the complex political divisions that had developed within Saxon society during Ceawlin's final years. On one side stood the aging king with his remaining loyal followers, professional warriors who had served him for decades, and territorial militias from regions that still acknowledged his authority. On the other side was a coalition that may have included not only Ceawl's domestic supporters, but also external enemies who saw this as their opportunity to finally destroy Saxon hegemony in southern England. Archaeological analysis of weapons and equipment from this period reveals the high quality of military technology available to both sides, with sophisticated pattern-welded swords, advanced spear points, and defensive equipment that represented the pinnacle of 6th century warfare. The battlefield would have been dominated by the clash of professional warriors equipped with the finest weapons that Saxon craftsmanship could produce. The tactical approach employed by both sides during the engagement can be inferred from archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts of similar battles throughout the Anglo-Saxon world. The traditional Saxon emphasis on infantry combat, coordinated shield wall tactics, and individual warrior prowess would have created a brutal and closely contested engagement where superior numbers or tactical position could determine the outcome. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's description of the battle as involving great slaughter suggests that this was an exceptionally bloody engagement where neither side was willing to concede defeat easily. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites throughout Anglo-Saxon England indicates that such descriptions typically referred to conflicts where casualties were unusually heavy and the fighting was particularly intense. The decisive defeat suffered by Ceawlin's forces at Woden's Barrow marked not only the end of his personal reign, but the collapse of the entire political and military system that had sustained West Saxon expansion for more than 3 decades. The speed and completeness of this collapse demonstrates how dependent the entire territorial empire had been on the king's personal authority and military reputation. Archaeological evidence from the immediate aftermath of the battle reveals the systematic dismantling of Ceawlin's power structure throughout Wessex. Royal centres were abandoned or occupied by new authorities, administrative networks were disrupted, and the complex system of territorial control that had governed the expanded kingdom simply disintegrated in the face of political revolution. The fate of Ceawlin's supporters following their defeat provides insights into the brutal realities of political failure in 6th century Anglo-Saxon society. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of the king's closest followers either died in battle or were executed during the subsequent political purge, while others fled to exile in distant kingdoms where they might find protection from the victorious Ceawl. The personal impact of defeat on Ceawlin himself must have been devastating for a man who had spent his entire adult life accumulating military victories and territorial conquests. To be driven from the throne he had occupied for more than 3 decades by his own nephew represented not only political failure, but personal betrayal that would have been emotionally catastrophic for any leader. The symbolic significance of Ceawlin's defeat at a site sacred to Woden added religious and cultural dimensions to his political downfall. In Saxon belief systems, military defeat was often interpreted as evidence that the gods had withdrawn their favour from a ruler, making it extremely difficult for him to rebuild support or challenge the legitimacy of his successors. Archaeological evidence from the period immediately following the battle reveals the rapid consolidation of power by Ceawlin and his supporters throughout the former territories of Ceawlin's kingdom. New administrative appointments were made, territorial boundaries were redrawn, and the complex system of alliances and tributary relationships that had sustained West Saxon hegemony was either abandoned or redirected to serve new political purposes. The international consequences of Ceawlin's downfall were immediate and far-reaching, as neighbouring kingdoms moved quickly to exploit the power vacuum created by Saxon political collapse. Archaeological evidence reveals Mercian expansion into territories that had been under West Saxon control, while British kingdoms began recovering lands that had been lost during earlier Saxon campaigns. The territorial losses that followed Ceawlin's defeat effectively ended the dream of Saxon hegemony over southern England that had motivated his expansion campaigns for more than 3 decades. Archaeological evidence reveals the abandonment of Saxon positions throughout the upper Thames Valley and Severn region, as limited resources were concentrated on defending core territories around the original West Saxon heartland. The administrative challenge facing Ceawlin as he attempted to consolidate control over what remained of the West Saxon kingdom was enormous, requiring him to rebuild governmental systems while simultaneously dealing with external threats and internal opposition. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of the sophisticated administrative innovations that had characterized Ceawlin's rule were abandoned in favour of simpler systems that were easier to control but less effective at generating wealth and maintaining territorial integration. The economic impact of political revolution and territorial loss was severe and lasting, with archaeological evidence revealing declining prosperity, reduced trade activity, and scaled-back settlement development throughout the former territories of Ceawlin's empire. The wealth that had sustained Saxon expansion and territorial control was either lost to enemies or consumed in the conflicts that accompanied dynastic change. The cultural consequences of Ceawlin's downfall extended beyond immediate political and economic effects to influence the entire trajectory of Anglo-Saxon cultural development. The sophisticated artistic traditions, architectural innovations, and cultural synthesis that had flourished under his patronage were disrupted by political instability and resource limitations that affected creative achievement for generations. The military lessons learned from Ceawlin's defeat influenced Saxon strategic thinking for decades to come, demonstrating both the possibilities and the limitations of territorial expansion based on personal authority and military prowess. Future Saxon rulers would need to develop more institutionalized approaches to governance that could survive transitions in leadership and political crisis. The succession of Ceawlin to the West Saxon throne marked the beginning of a new era in the kingdom's development, but also represented a fundamental break with the expansionist policies and territorial ambitions that had characterized Ceawlin's reign. Archaeological evidence suggests that the new king was primarily concerned with consolidating control over remaining territories, rather than pursuing further conquest or territorial integration. The psychological impact of witnessing the fall of such a successful and long-reigning monarch must have been profound for observers throughout Anglo-Saxon England. Ceawlin's career had demonstrated that individual rulers could achieve remarkable territorial expansion and political dominance, but his sudden downfall also showed how quickly such achievements could be lost when political circumstances changed. Archaeological evidence from royal sites throughout England during this period reveals increased attention to defensive preparations and succession planning that suggest other Saxon rulers had learned valuable lessons from Ceawlin's experience. The importance of maintaining internal political consensus and avoiding the vulnerabilities created by unclear succession arrangements became apparent to rulers who hoped to avoid similar fates. The historiographical treatment of Ceawlin's defeat in later sources reflects the complex legacy of his achievements and failures. While he was remembered as one of the great conquering kings of the Anglo-Saxon period, his ultimate downfall also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overextension and the importance of maintaining political consensus among key constituencies. As the dust settled on the battlefield of Woden's Barrow and Ceawlin began his final year of exile and decline, the immediate consequences of his defeat were already reshaping the political landscape of southern England. The territorial empire he had spent decades building was fragmenting. The administrative systems he had developed were being dismantled, and the dream of Saxon hegemony that had motivated his entire career was fading into historical memory.